Welcome, and thank you for joining us at Learning Beyond Tomorrow, the Education Leadership Forum organized by Oxford University Press, China. So I'm Michael, your MC for today, and at this webinar, we have a very special, honorable speaker, and this is a webinar that many of us have also been waiting for because we have Mr. Andreas Schleicher joining us all the way live from Paris. Andreas is the Director of Education and Skills at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as the OECD. He initiated and oversees the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, and other international instruments that have, over the years, created a global platform for policymakers, researchers, and educators across the world, and also across cultures, to innovate and to transform educational policies and practices. Andreas has also worked for over 20 years with ministers and education leaders around the world to improve the quality and equity in education. And before joining the OECD, he was Director for Analysis at the International Association for Education Achievement, IEA. And today we have the pleasure of hearing from Andreas on the topic of scenarios for future education. So without further ado, I'd like to go to Andreas and let's hear from him. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you in Hong Kong this afternoon for this conference. Obviously, this is a moment where our attention is still very much absorbed by the pandemic that has just deeply disrupted our way of working in education and maybe also our thinking about education. But one thing is certain, the future will always surprise us. Nobody can predict what's going to happen tomorrow. Nobody can predict the future. But we should become better to think in terms of alternative scenarios for the future of education. And if we become more agile in our thinking, to think of different possibilities, opportunities, we'll be better prepared for the future that eventually arise. And some things are sure. We know that climate change is probably going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence creates a lot more uncertainty than this pandemic. We know how to educate second-class robots, people who are very good at repeating what we told them. But what will make us human in a time where the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have also become easy to digitize, to automate? So things are disappearing from our labor market. These are the questions that education needs to answer these days. We spend a lot of time in education on the how, the methodology, the pedagogy, the learning environments. We spend actually very little time to explore the what. What is it that young people need to learn to be prepared for their future, not just our past? And of course, you can add a lot more factors into this equation that will shape the future of education. And we analyze them very regularly at the OECD. Now, in 2018, in our last PISA assessment, we surveyed school leaders about the extent to which some of these global forces are already part of their curriculum. And the answers are very encouraging. You can see, 9 out of 10 school leaders in the industrialized world, the OECD countries say, yeah, climate change and global warming is part of our school curriculum. And the same is true for gender equity, for international conflict, poverty, migration, and so on. Even pandemics, that was before the pandemic. You can see 8 out of 10 school leaders say, yeah, that's something that we cover. But, when we surveyed students, we got a slightly different picture. Take the example of the environment. You can see basically 8 out of 10 students say, yeah, looking after the global environment, it's really important to me. Now, the climate agenda has become urgent, important for the next generation. But, when we ask them, do you think you can do something about it? Or do you think what you do will make a difference to people elsewhere? The bars get a lot shorter now. And that symbolizes the problem of our education today. We make young people passive recipients of a lot of knowledge, but we don't create that agency that allows them to mobilize their cognitive, social, and emotional resources. That is the gap that we need to close, the gap between, just absorbing and replicating knowledge, and being agents, developing agency and co-agency. Can you live with yourself? Can you live with other people? Can you live with the planet? Now, those are the big questions that we need to ask ourselves. And knowledge, of course, will always be at the center. But what is very clear is, once again, that routine cognitive skills will not prepare us for our future. No, they prepare us for the world of robots. We need to become better to educate complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working. No? And also in the past, education was very, very good at sorting people. No? Our economies only needed a few really well-educated workers and a lot of people working for them. And that was easy to, provide. Today, we need everybody to succeed. You can see that in Hong Kong, but also elsewhere. People without a great education have, a steep kind of uphill struggle in front of them. Technology and globalization are polarizing our societies by the skills that people have. And that, of course, requires a very different caliber of educators and learning environments. When you just need a few people to succeed, you sort people by a kind of standardized mechanism. When you want everybody to succeed, you need to understand how different students learn differently and engage with that diversity through different pedagogical strategies. And of course, great people don't like to work in the factories. In our school systems still are very much, have a very industrial work organization. How do we create a more professional work organization, a more flat, collegial, entrepreneurial environment? Those are the questions that I like to sort of study with you this afternoon. Starting out from the first part, how do we move from just, getting students to reproduce the established wisdom of our times, to questioning the wisdom of our times, to creating knowledge. And actually, the forces behind this are not difficult to understand. We see a decline in the demand for routine tasks, an increase in the demand for technology-intensive tasks. You put the two things together, that's the future of work. It's not magic. It's not rocket science. It's very easy to understand. And you can even quantify this. On the vertical axis, you can see the skills of people in countries. On the horizontal axis, you can see the risk of automation that system societies face. And you can see there's a clear link between the two. The best protector against the risk of automation is the skills of people. Quality and equity in the distribution of skills. That's something that we need to worry about. Now, I just said, that's what we need. But if you ask young people at the age of 15 in our PISA assessment, you can see, 30, 40, sometimes more than 50% of 15-year-olds aspire to jobs that are at a high risk of automation. Our school systems create an image for the future among young people and aspirations among young people that are well in the past, that are not in the future. Schools are very, very good at keeping students inside and the rest of the world outside. We need to build better bridges, give students more realistic, more higher aimed aspirations to, prepare themselves to become the engineers of tomorrow's future. And as you can see here, we're not very good at this, particularly not for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. They're actually, even more prone to be educated and learn for a world that no longer exists. And if you think about the future of digitalization, it's been incredibly democratizing. Everybody can collaborate, participate in our processes, in our societies. Technology has also been incredibly homogenizing, concentrating power at a rate we've never seen before. Few kind of companies determine how people work and think and so on. Technology has been incredibly particularizing. You post something on Baidu or Twitter or anywhere, and the world can follow you. But once again, it's also been incredibly homogenizing, squashing individual differences, cultural uniqueness, raising questions of identity. Technology has been incredibly empowering. The most successful companies these days are no longer created by a big industry. Now they are created by a big idea. They have the product before they have the money. A technology can also be incredibly disempowering when we become the slaves of algorithms that we no longer understand. That's the kind of two sides of the same coin and the reality with which our education systems need to deal with. So learning is no longer about teaching students something. It's about helping them develop a reliable compass and the navigation tools to find their own way through this world that is so increasingly volatile, ambiguous, complex, and so on. Of course, knowledge will always matter, but it's less about the surface of knowledge. Of course, if you want to do science, you have to know things of biology and chemistry, but more important these days is, can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? Those things are more important. History is no longer just about names and places. It's about, do you understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes? Can you think like a mathematician? We spend a lot of time to teach students how to calculate an exponential function. We spend far too little time to give them the idea of the nature of an exponential function. If we had done better, with that, we would have sent, if people would really grasp the concept of an exponential function, we would have sent, thousands of doctors to fight the coronavirus, not a few hundred when it broke out. These, of course, concepts are very difficult to grasp for humans. No? We're all born into linear spaces. Time is linear, space is linear. That's the world in which we are comfortable with. Exponential phenomena are not intuitive to us. But again, that's the point of education. The world of mathematics could open you a new world if we understand, if we teach the foundations of it, the concepts, the ideas, rather than the knowledge at the surface. No? It's also increasingly important for people to think across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines. Now, innovation is no longer just about you being very, very good in one discipline. No, it's about you being able to connect the dots where the next big idea is going to come from. And if you want your students to think across the boundaries of disciplines, your teachers need to be able to collaborate across the disciplines to create project-based immersive learning environments. And again, knowledge is important, but it's just a start. The modern world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Google and Baidu, they know everything. The world rewards you what you can do with what you know. That's the big difference. That brings us to the world of skills. And of course, when you think about skills, the first thought goes to cognitive and metacognitive skills, creativity, critical thinking. And yes, they're very, very important. But increasingly important are also social emotional skills. Empathy, courage, leadership, resilience, curiosity, you name it. Those kind of social emotional skills are probably one of the biggest differentiators from the technologies we've created in our computers. So if you put it together, it's about our human capacity to imagine, to create things of intrinsic positive worth. It's about our capacity to navigate ambiguity, to reconcile and manage tensions and dilemmas, and ultimately about mobilizing our cognitive, social, and emotional resources, that agency, that co-agency. I'll give you just one indicator from our PISA assessment. In 2018, we measured something that we call the growth mindset of young people. Concept, developed by Carl Dweck. And actually what it says is that, if you're doing well on growth mindset, you believe that you can extend your limit. You can grow beyond your limits. You can master the unknown. As opposed that you believe, well, success is about the intelligence I was born with. That's the fixed mindset here on the left side. And those two things, when you actually see them connected with learning outcomes on the vertical axis here, you can see those things are very closely connected at the level of individual students and even more so at the level of education systems. You take an education system like Estonia, and you can see actually you're doing very well on the PISA test, very good in academic performance, and students have that growth mindset. You contrast this with Indonesia, where you can see students are struggling academically, and most of them believe that success is about the intelligence I was born with. And then, why should I struggle with? And the reason I show you this at the system level and not at the individual level is because it illustrates this is something we can do about something. We can create an environment in which students, build that agency, build that growth mindset. When you look at Hong Kong, it's an interesting outlier, isn't it? You can see on the one hand, students are doing extremely well academically, but then they get very much on the left side of the equation, where actually too many young people believe, there's nothing that I can do. I don't have that agency, that growth mindset. And I'm talking here about the link between growth mindset and academic performance, but that's not the end of the story. You can see students with the growth mindset, they're more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. And once again, if you want young people in Hong Kong to be creative, imaginative, you have to give them space to experiment. If you give them, space to experiment, they need to take risks. If they take risks, they will make mistakes. If our education systems do not help people to learn from and with mistakes, maybe young people will not become so creative. But even more, people with a growth mindset were more willing to establish ambitious learning goals and see greater value in school. So again, schooling is not just about the delivery of content knowledge. It's very much about the mindset that we are creating among young people, the agency that we build. Let's turn to the second point. How do we move from, just having some people succeed to getting everybody succeed? And actually, I want to credit Hong Kong for this. I actually think Hong Kong is a place where actually the education system does really well in general to leverage the extraordinary talent of ordinary students. If you come from a disadvantaged background in Hong Kong, you have a far better chance to get a good education than, in the United States or Europe, in most countries in Europe. So I think that's something you should be proud of, but there's things to improve. When you ask yourself, what school do I choose for my child? It matters a lot in Hong Kong. There's a lot of variability in the quality of schooling in the system. Look at Finland here. Only 5% of the performance variation in the student population lies between schools. The closest school is always the best school. You don't have to worry where you send your child because the system produces quite predictable quality. At the other end of the spectrum is Israel, where the majority of the performance variation lies between schools. It matters hugely where you send your child. And Hong Kong is tending to that as well. Still quite a lot of variability in the school system. Making that more predictable, more systemic, I think is an important objective. And you can see some of that variability comes with, the allocation of resources. And you want to be on the green part of this chart, where basically the most challenging environments attract the best people. But there's good alignment of resources and needs. But when you look to Hong Kong, like in many other countries, it's in the red part. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you're more likely to get also the less qualified teacher and a poorer learning environment. So bringing resources and needs better together is a huge objective for the education system. And there are actually places in Asia doing really well on this now. We have, when we had data from the province of Shanghai in China, they have been very, very good to attract, talented principals and talented teachers to disadvantaged schools. And they were able to moderate. They had a very similar picture like for Hong Kong, but they were able to actually bring that closer together. And you can see the same in Estonia, in Finland, Canada. So I think this is a manageable system. Let's talk a little bit about work organization. How do we move from a system that is industrial in its outlook, where people look upwards, to a system where people actually do look upwards? You ask yourself, what is professionalism, teacher professionalism? Well, it includes several elements. The one is, the knowledge of teachers. Now, what do teachers know about their subject? The first thing your students discover is whether you have a real passion for what you teach, whether you can create that passion in your students. Second thing is, do you know how different students learn differently? That is that pedagogical kind of element. But then there's a third element, and that's about what do you know about your students as individuals? I think, after the pandemic, after school closures, what students will remember from their teachers and from the crisis in 10 years' time is probably, their teacher who they felt really knows and appreciates them, who understands their dreams and passions, who understands who they are and who they want to become. Education is never a transactional enterprise. It is always a relational, a social enterprise. And some education systems, and I think that's an important element for the future, pay more attention to this. They give teachers more space to build that kind of social relationships. Maybe teach less, but spend more time with individual students. If you go to Finland, 30% of instruction time is now delivered outside the classroom setting. You as a teacher have many opportunities to actually work with students. The second element is, professional autonomy. To what extent are teachers creative designers of innovative learning environments? And professional autonomy is not about, I do what I like to do. It's about, I do what I know is right in the name of my profession. But then there's a third element, and that's the collaborative culture that we have in education. The extent to which teachers engage in professional learning communities, do lesson study, actually is traditionally a great strength of many East Asian education systems. Not so much in Hong Kong. You go to Japan, you'll find a very strong culture of lesson study. If you go to Singapore, very well organized professional learning communities. I think this is a very important element. Why do I say this? Because our data show that the more teachers teach jointly as a team in the same class, the more they observe other teachers' classes, provide feedback, the more they engage in joint activities across different classes. The more they take part in collaborative learning, the more likely they're using up-to-date and effective teaching practices. The good practices rarely come top-down. The good practices are always created at the front line. If you want to be a great leader, don't ask yourself how well your teachers follow your instructions. Ask yourself, how well can your teachers collaborate? How well can they actually identify good practice, scale it, analyze it, bring it to the system? That's what we call professional ownership. And we see that in many other areas, much better than in the field of education. The medical profession, most doctors are participating in clinical trials. They see themselves as owners of professional practice and professional standards. We can do better in education still. But it's not the end of the story. You can see actually a more collaborative culture is associated with greater job satisfaction of teachers. In fact, we don't see much of a link between the salary levels of teachers and job satisfaction, or between the size of the classes and job satisfaction. Actually, no link at all. But we do see a very strong link between the collaborative culture and teachers' job satisfaction. How do we move from a culture of prescription, to a culture of professional ownership? It has to do, of course, with who makes decisions at what level. And there is a huge level of variation about this. In some education systems, you have here the Netherlands, 9 out of 10 decisions are made at the school level, at the front line, by teachers. If you go to Turkey or Greece, it's less than 1 in 10, or Switzerland. Huge variability in the extent to which schools are the drivers of practice. In many countries, it's more of higher areas in the system. Hong Kong is a very interesting exception to this. Some things are very decentralized, a lot of responsibility at the front line, and other things are highly centralized. The exam system sort of keeps the whole system together, even though it's not actually part of the formal governance mechanism. But those questions really matter. And we can see, for example, very clearly where school leaders have, a greater role in shaping resources, designing curricula, doing disciplinary policies, and things like this. You can see actually results tend to do better, and the same is true for teachers. So again, this is something that actually matters. I also want to come back to this issue. The past was divided, teachers and content was divided by subject areas, student destinations, students attending programs, preparing them for something specific. And in the future, we need to probably a much more integrated environment now. where we try to do better integrated of the school subjects to help students learn and think across the boundaries of disciplines. To better integrate students. Inclusion is the kind of call of our times. How can we give every learner an environment in which they can thrive and realize their potential? How can we, connect schools with the real world? It's very clear that some students learn a lot better when they work with real people on real problems that have real consequences. That's why often, high quality vocational education and training should not be a last resort, but it's actually in some countries a first choice, my own country included, because actually of the type of learning styles and environments it offers to people. And you can see actually parents matter a lot in this. And I think you in Hong Kong are very privileged to have parents who are very demanding, very kind of exigent, they have high expectations. They provide a lot of support to their children. I think that's a great asset of the system. And you can see basically where students say that their parents are interested in their school activities. They are much more ambitious in their schooling. They're also more satisfied with their lives. That's also interesting that actually school, the kind of life satisfaction that young people find is a lot related to what happens in school and is a lot related to the attitude that parents have to school. Very last point is, how do we move from a kind of very idiosyncratic approach to public policy to an approach that is, framed by better alignment of policies? But again, I've talked about some dimensions shaping the future of education, some, demands placed on school systems. But what about those scenarios, those alternative futures? Well, let's put a few on the table. One is clearly, the status quo will evolve. And that's, some people say after the pandemic, no, now everything is going to be different. But, we have said this many times before in history. Education is actually a very conservative social environment. It is very, very hard to transform. It's like, moving graveyards. You can often not rely on the people out there to help you. And sometimes we as parents are not the solution. We are part of the problem. We get very anxious when our children no longer learn what was very important to us. Or we get even more anxious when they do learn things we no longer understand. And teachers are often more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And, as a policymaker, you can easily lose an election over education. When something goes wrong, people get very upset because it affects their children. But you never win an election over education, just because it takes so much time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. So it's very, very hard to change this now. And what we talk about in education, the structures, the resources, time, spaces, this is just, the small tip of a huge iceberg. The 90% of the iceberg that is under the waterline is about the interests of people, the fears of people, the motivations of people. We don't see that. And that's where the big collisions occur. And that's why, the status quo in education has so many protectors. There are huge asymmetries between, the benefits of reform and change that are long-term, that are uncertain, and the costs that are, here and now, we have to pay for it, and so on. So I wouldn't dismiss that scenario. But, that scenario bears great risk. Maybe one day, the system will crack apart under its own pressures. That's, we have seen elements of that in the pandemic. Our education systems proved to be not very resilient to external shocks. And again, the future will always surprise us. Second scenario, well, maybe one day people will look for alternative solutions. They go for opportunities outside the formal education system. Digitalization provides a lot of kind of room for that. And we can see, for young people, the digital world is already the real world. But you see and this is even in 2018, you could see students spending 30, 40, sometimes close to 50 hours per week on the internet. And actually a big chunk of that in school that's the yellow part of the picture here. In Hong Kong, you keep your students very busy with schooling, so they're not so much. But even there, it's 30 hours per week. That is a big part of time. That's, a significant fraction of the time adults spend working. But being born into the digital world doesn't mean that you're digital natives. When you actually look at the capacity of students to actively navigate the internet, things look very different. You can see Hong Kong, now together with Singapore, Korea, and the regions of China, is one of the top performers when it comes to students being able to distinguish fact from opinion, to navigate complexity, to integrate multiple sources, those kinds of skills that you need to actually make active and good use of the internet. Top performer. But, look at the chat. Half of your students, half of the 15-year-olds have limited or often no navigation skills. Of course, they can operate their mobile phone or their computer, but again, that doesn't mean that they can actually, make productive, active, critical use out of those resources. And in many countries, that's the majority of young people. Well, you can say humanity has always been better to invent new tools than to use them wisely. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it's something that's become very real. In the year 2000, when we started with our PISA assessment, you could afford it. You could basically say, well, students read curated school books, they're carefully authored, basically government approved usually. So we are certain that what they read is correct. And when they have a question, they can look it up and they can believe the answer to be correct. Well, but today, that's not longer true. You look up things on, a search engine, you get 100,000 answers to your question, and nobody will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. And you can see really here, we lag behind. But technology is going to, push us forward into new domains. Technology can make learning so much more granular, so much more interactive, so much more adaptive. It holds great potential to fundamentally transform learning experiences. Now remember, whether that is for good or for bad is going to depend on humans. Artificial intelligence and technology are not magic powers. They're just extraordinary amplifiers and accelerators. They amplify good educational practice, good ideas, in the same way as they amplify bad ideas and bad educational practice. It's going to be the humans, the educators, that determine to what extent, those forces will make learning more, productive, more interactive, more social, more, focused on critical skills, or whether technology is going to make learning more scripted, more reactive, more superficial. I think, that's what the scenarios are meaning. They are sort of in our hands. And, I don't tell you something abstract here. Actually, when I look at technology intensity and the quality of learning outcomes, in most countries, it's negatively related, and that includes Hong Kong. Actually, the more technology is being utilized in education systems, the worse students perform in digital literacy. That doesn't speak against technology. What it means is that we are not really using the technology, the spaces, the people, and the time in the ways that they lead to superior learning outcomes. What you see here is that, yes, actually technology use sometimes makes learning more superficial, less productive. Sometimes it's a waste of time. Sometimes the technology gets into the way rather than, becoming a force. The best technology is the one that is invisible, that is in the background, where you use, you create big data, where you can have learning analytics supporting you. So I think that's very, very important. But let's add a third scenario. And maybe, we can see that in Northern Europe today, where the idea of schooling becomes a very different one, where schools really become learning hubs. They're no longer just academic institutions, but they're seen as deliberate entities to build society. School doors are open. A lot of learning takes place outside school doors, at workplaces, in society, in cultural institutions. There's a lot of attention paid so that students experience, the diversity in our environments, in our communities. That you learn physics not just from a physics teacher, but maybe also from a car mechanic, or biology from a nurse, rather than just from biology teacher. That is a very different concept, very different idea of schooling. an idea that is not just focused on the initial education, but that also says, well, the school should be a center that accompanies throughout our lives, where teachers are not just great instructors, but also good coaches, good mentors, good facilitators, good evaluators, good psychologists, good social workers. If you're a teacher in Finland, they say that's what school expects from you. Your role is to support the holistic development of learners. It's not just to teach mathematics or science, and you will get the resources that you need to do that well, and the professional environment and the support. Very different scenario from the preceding one. And then, of course, there's a fourth scenario. Maybe one day we will no longer talk about educational institutions. Maybe one day, we will just learn as we go. Learning will take place everywhere, anytime, technology enabled. We will see that, our learning curve will become steeper and steeper. The learning resources will become ever better, but also the demands on people to continue to learn, but also to be ready to unlearn and relearn will put incredible demands on us. The accelerating pace that we see around us is the biggest challenge to humanity, because we are designed, we are made for changes on geological kind of timescales. We're not designed for changing mindsets in minutes and aspirations in seconds. But maybe that is one scenario, that actually the institutional form of learning, where you sort of learn and then you get to work, is dissipating. Maybe one day learning becomes the main part of our work. I will make very different supportive environments about this. So. And then, of course, comes the question, where do you put the balance between humans and technology in such a scenario? It's like, as a self-driving car. At the beginning, you've got a few devices in your car that make your life as a driver easier, and then technology takes over more and more functions. And then, one day, a car drives without needing you. Of course, in this case, it's a great thing. It's something that we all dream about. But what about education? Where do we see that balance between, teacher-centered, teacher-enabled, teacher-administered learning and, student-centered, technology-enabled learning? Again, there are many shades of gray that we need to get comfortable with, we need to articulate. The worst is, if we just let ourselves be driven by this, to be driven by what is technologically possible rather than by the social needs of people. Unfortunately, that's a bit the tendency that we see. We will do whatever, technology allows us to do. And again, I think this is the kind of questions that we should be debating, discussing when we design scenarios for the future of education. And the last element is, just money. Venture capital in the field of education is tiny when you compare it with the field of the health sector. Also money in innovation. We spend about 17 times as much resources on innovation and research in the medical sector than in the education sector. It's not twice as much, it's not 3 times as much, it's 17 times as much. And that tells you a lot about education. Education is also often not perceived as a sector where people working there believe that their practice can be transformed by ideas, by research, by evidence. But coming back to global education venture capital, it is tiny, and it's only a story of a few countries. In 2014, you could see it was mainly a story about the United States. Basically, 60% of global education venture capital came from there. Today, it's mainly a story about China. Just one country. If I look at Europe, where I live, the small green segment, very little contribution. Also, the United States is quite limited today. And so again, I think a lot of countries will have to do a lot more work if they want to engage more players into this. And now, of course, you can add many more scenarios to this. This is just, 4 scenarios to give you some ideas to think about the future. And the point is not the number of scenarios. The point is our ability to become better, to think in terms of alternative futures. And then to ask ourselves, what do those futures mean for the goals and functioning of education systems? For the organization of instructors? How do we configure time, space, people, the technology to build, superior systems. What does it mean for the educator? What is our vision for the role of educators in tomorrow's school systems under different scenarios? The instructor, the coach, the mentor, the facilitator, the evaluator, the social worker, the psychologist. What is our vision? Are they there to, give young people a good start? Are they there to accompany people throughout their lives? Very different question. What does it mean for governance and geopolitics? How do we actually run our education systems? How do we deal with the kind of political economy of change, creating the dynamics that keep education moving forward? And then, of course, what does it mean for our public authorities that, ultimately are in charge of all of this? And the answers are never going to be clear cut. You're always going to face many tensions and dilemmas. What is the right balance between modernizing and disrupting our school systems? Of course, disruption happens sometimes without being intentional. But what if we want to be sort of more intentional of disrupting our systems? What if we put a greater, focus on creative destruction in our education? How do we reconcile new goals in education with our existing structures? We won't change our structures quickly. They evolve. But what about the goals? How do we reconcile, the desire to create globally minded students and educators who remain still locally rooted in their culture, in their tradition, find identity, find meaning in their local context? How do we reconcile a focus on innovation with, again, education as a very conservative social enterprise? We talk about innovation, everybody supports reform except for their own children. You can see that in Hong Kong, even, slight education reforms, things that actually, are quite modest in their ambition, create a lot of anxiety among people. That is the reality in which we live. How do we actually get the balance right to make sure that education advances, but taking the people with us, parents included? How do we leverage potential with the reality that we face today? I know we're all waiting for a new spaceship that is going to bring us a generation of wonderfully prepared, technology literate teachers. But that's not going to arrive. The reality is as it is. And I think we need to sort of realize potential with the reality. And every other sector needs to do this as well. How do we reconcile the virtual and the face-to-face? The pandemic has given us some, new insights, experiences, created greater social acceptance for technology as well. We didn't have that in the past. There's an opportunity. But, what is the right balance? What's the right role of technology in education? What's the right role of humans? And then, maybe we should also think about a better balance between learning and education, creating that sense of agency for students to expand the horizon, that growth mindset, rather than looking at this only through the lens of supply side. Lots of challenges for your conference, but these are just a few ideas. And I really want to thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, Andreas. And it's certainly really inspiring to hear from you, to know some of to hear you share some of the scenarios about the future of education and the action we need to take, and also how we should change our attitude and mindset in order to get to where to meet the needs of the future in education. And at this point, let's open the floor for questions, and already have a few questions waiting in line. So I go straight to the first one, and already word for word. First question, in your experience, what are the triggers that would motivate a government to cut curriculum and to give teacher or students more time to explore and to innovate?
I think it's one of the hardest questions. I think it's so easy for us to add new things to the curriculum. As a politician, you make yourselves very happy if you, tomorrow add digital literacy, then environmental literacy, then financial literacy. I think there are a lot of incentives and triggers for people to add new things of the curriculum. But each and every one of us knows that the future is about teaching fewer things at greater depths. And unfortunately, I don't think there is a natural trigger. In fact, it takes enormous courage on the part of politicians and educators to teach fewer things at greater depths, to reduce the curriculum. Because you'll always find, some lobbies who say, "Oh, you take out the most important part from the learning environment. You are dumbing down our school system." I worked on that, when Japan in the early 2000s reduced 30% of curriculum content, and that was a hugely contested development. And so I don't think there is a natural trigger, but I do think that is exactly what we should expect from political leaders, to have that courage to explain to their populations that less means more, and that we need to give teachers more space to actually teach deep conceptual understanding rather than on the surface. And we should also, give policymakers better evidence that that is the right thing to do. The Japanese case is very interesting. They cut a lot of educational content, but the country actually improved on the PISA league tables. In fact, students became better on creative thinking, on critical thinking, on those types of tasks that were open-ended. So in a way, I think time will tell that this is the right approach. But I do think, there is no trigger. It is about, political leadership and courage, and also getting educators and parents on board. You need to explain those issues well to parents, well to teachers, and then, stick to that.
And thank you. And just moving forward to the next question, and this is how it's go. I think it's, in a way, related to the first question. There are some countries that have their curriculum trimmed down during the pandemic, or are they considering trimming down the curriculum even after the pandemic. What's your view or the OECD's view about such a development?
Well, once again, I think the future is about teaching fewer things at greater depths, giving students more space to master deep conceptual understanding rather than just the surface of educational content, which will change very rapidly. I think things on the surface will change. If we do not have students who understand the foundations of a discipline, they will be lost in this world. And if you go to Estonia today, the entire curriculum is just about 45 pages. They're actually they've been very radical in cutting out things that are not instrumental. We have to be honest and ask ourselves, a lot of what we teach today is just the baggage of a long gone past. When we started on the PISA assessment testing mathematics, we went around the world to ask, look, what do students learn at the age of 15 in mathematics? And we found, trigonometry was very prominent in school curricula. So I went to ask the mathematicians, is trigonometry one of the founding principles, the ideas of mathematics? And they would tell me, no, actually it's just a specific application of mathematics. It's not something particularly central. So I thought, maybe it's a skill that you need in the workplace. So I asked the engineers, you need people with trigonometry skills? They said, well, not really. That's basically what is done by computers today. The answer to this question lies 300-400 years ago, when you needed those skills to measure the size of your fields. But we have, kept them because people say it's always been valuable, always been important. Let's continue with this. That's the challenge. But there are education systems that have gone towards a quite radical transformation, asking themselves, what are the foundations for tomorrow as well, and then giving also students and teachers a voice in shaping their learning environments. I think you find many good examples. Many countries are on the way to this. I think everybody understands that this is important. It's just very, very hard to do. And it is something that you need to, bring people along with you. But I don't think there's any way you can escape that. Otherwise, learning will become more and more superficial and more. And the third element I think that you can do as a policymaker is, adjust your gateways for success. Now, if we do not adjust our examinations, the goalposts in education, they send very powerful signals to students, to teachers, to parents. And if we do not make adjustments to that, adjustments in the curriculum will not have a much deep impact. No?
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Andreas. And now it's time to wrap up the webinar. And just on behalf of OUP, I just want to extend our warmest thanks to Andreas, who is the Director of Education Skills at OECD. And also thank you to all of the audience today who are joining us online and for staying with us for the whole day in this forum. And just want to mention that if you're watching online, you will be able to download our e-certificate from the website. And afterwards, we'll also be sending you a survey after today's webinar to collect your comments and feedback, so please comment generously. And now it's really the end of the forum, and from all of us here at Oxford University Press, wish you a good day, thank you, and goodbye to you all. Thank you.